The sun beat down on Blackwater Ridge like a hammer on an anvil, relentless and unforgiving. The town square was packed, too packed for comfort, too loud for peace. Dust swirled in the air, kicked up by boots and wagon wheels, coating everything in a thin layer of grit that tasted like desperation when you breathed it in. Eliza Thorne stood on a makeshift wooden platform in the center of it all, her hands clenched so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. She didn't feel it. She was too busy trying not to feel anything at all. Her father stood beside her, his face red and sweating, his voice booming across the crowd like a preacher condemning sin. Except he wasn't condemning sin. He was condemning her. "Strong back," he shouted, gesturing at her like she was livestock. "Good teeth. Can cook, clean, and work a field harder than most men I know. And I'm not asking much, just enough to settle my debts and get her off my hands." Eliza's jaw tightened. Off his hands. Like she was a burden he'd been carrying too long. Like she was something rotten he needed to discard before it spoiled everything else. The crowd murmured, but no one stepped forward. Men looked at her with calculating eyes, weighing her value against the coin in their pockets. Women whispered behind their hands, their expressions a mixture of pity and contempt. No one saw a person standing there. They saw a transaction, a problem, a warning of what happened when you didn't fit into the neat little boxes this town demanded. "She's got fire in her, I'll give her that," her father continued, his tone shifting to something almost apologetic, as if her spirit was a flaw that needed explaining. "Maybe too much fire for some men's taste, but hell, that just means she won't go quiet when times get hard. Ain't that worth something?" Too much fire. That's what they'd always said. Too loud, too stubborn, too unwilling to bow her head and smile when men spoke over her, too quick to argue when her father gambled away their food money, too proud to apologize for existing. And now here she was, standing in front of the entire town while her father auctioned her off like a horse with a bad temperament. A man near the front, barrel-chested with a thick beard and meaner eyes, spoke up. "How much you asking, Thorne?" Her father's face lit up. $200. That's more than fair for—" "Ain't nobody paying $200 for a woman like that," the man interrupted, spitting into the dirt. "Look at her. She's got fight written all over her. That ain't a wife. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Eliza's face burned, but she kept her chin up, her gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the buildings, beyond the judgment, beyond the shame. "150 then," her father said quickly, his desperation showing now. "Hell, 100. That's a steal." Silence. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the wind rattling through the dry grass and the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Eliza felt something crack inside her chest, not her heart, because she'd stopped expecting anything from these people a long time ago. It was something else, something deeper. The last fragile thread of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way out of this life that didn't involve humiliation. That thread snapped. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "You know what? Don't bother." Her father spun toward her, his eyes wide. "Eliza, shut your mouth." "No!" She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw nothing but a coward. A man who'd gambled away every cent they had, who'd drunk himself stupid more nights than she could count, who'd blamed her for every failure in his miserable life. "I'm done being your problem. You don't got a choice," he hissed, grabbing her arm. His grip was tight, bruising, but she didn't flinch. "Let go of me." "You'll do as I say, girl, or so help me." "Or what?" She yanked her arm free, stepping back. "You'll hit me? You've done that before. You'll throw me out? You're already trying to sell me. What else you got?" The crowd was dead silent now, every eye locked on the spectacle unfolding before them. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something raw and ugly, the kind of thing people would talk about in whispers for weeks. Her father's face twisted with rage. "You ungrateful little—" "I'm done," Eliza said again, louder this time. She turned to face the crowd, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "If anyone here thinks they can tame me, you're a fool. I'm not some broken thing you can fix. I'm not some quiet little wife who'll smile and nod while you ruin everything good in your life. So if you're smart, you'll stay exactly where you are." And then she jumped down from the platform and started walking. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't stay there, couldn't stand on that stage for one more second, while people decided whether she was worth the trouble. "Eliza," her father shouted after her. "You get back here right now, or I swear all you want," she called over her shoulder. "I'm leaving. You got nowhere to go." That stopped her. Not because he was wrong, but because he was right. She had no money, no friends, no family that gave a damn whether she lived or died. She had nothing but the clothes on her back and the rage burning in her chest. But she'd rather have nothing than this. She turned around one last time, her eyes sweeping over the crowd. And that's when she saw him. He stood at the edge of the square, half hidden in the shadow of the general store. Tall. Taller than anyone else there, with broad shoulders and a face carved from stone. Dark hair, dark eyes, dark presence. He didn't belong in the crowd. He looked like he belonged in the wilderness, where the rules were different and survival was the only law that mattered. Caleb Voss. She'd heard the name before, whispered like a curse. The mountain man. The recluse. The man who'd killed 3 men in a bar fight years ago and walked away without a scratch. The man who lived alone in the high country, miles from civilization, where no one dared follow. He was watching her. Not with pity, like some of the women. Not with calculation, like the men. He was just watching. Like he saw something the others didn't. Or maybe like he saw exactly what they saw and didn't care. Eliza didn't know what possessed her in that moment. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was defiance. Maybe it was just the reckless urge to do something so bold and stupid that no one would ever forget her name. She walked straight toward him. The crowd murmured. Her father shouted something, but she didn't hear it. All she heard was the crunch of dirt beneath her boots and the hammering of her own heart. When she stopped in front of Caleb Voss, she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. Up close, he was even more intimidating. Scars on his knuckles, a jagged line across his jaw, eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and felt too little. "You looking for a wife?" she asked. His expression didn't change. "No." "Too bad. You just got one." For the first time, something flickered in those dark eyes. Not quite surprise, more like interest. "That's so. That's so." She crossed her arms, refusing to back down even though her knees were shaking. "You take me out of this town right now, and I'll work harder than any man you've ever met. I'll cook, I'll clean, I'll chop wood, haul water, whatever you need. I won't complain, I won't cry, and I won't slow you down. And what do I get out of it? Someone who won't ask questions, someone who won't run when things get hard, someone who's got nothing left to lose." She paused, then added, "And someone who's got more fire than anyone in this godforsaken town can handle." Caleb studied her for a long moment. The silence stretched between them, thick and tense. The crowd was watching, whispering, waiting to see what the monster would do with the desperate girl. Finally, he spoke. "You got a horse?" "No." "Supplies?" "No." "Anything?" "Just me." Another pause. Then, to her utter shock, he nodded. "Get on." He gestured toward a massive black horse tied up nearby, its coat gleaming like oil in the sunlight. The animal looked as mean as its owner, all muscle and barely contained power. Eliza didn't hesitate. She walked over, grabbed the saddle horn, and hauled herself up. It wasn't graceful, but she managed. Caleb untied the reins and swung up behind her in one smooth motion. His presence was overwhelming, solid and unyielding, like being trapped between a rock and a hard place. But she didn't flinch. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and rough, close to her ear. She looked back at the crowd, at her father, red-faced and furious, at the people who'd watched her suffer and done nothing, at the town that had decided she was too much trouble to be worth anything. "Yeah," she said. "I'm sure." Caleb didn't say another word. He just spurred the horse forward, and they rode out of Blackwater Ridge without looking back. The first hour was silent. The landscape changed quickly once they left the town behind. Flat, dusty plains giving way to rolling hills, then rocky terrain that climbed steadily upward. The air grew cooler, sharper, tinged with the scent of pine and earth. Civilization fell away like a shed skin, leaving nothing but wilderness in its wake. Eliza kept her spine straight, refusing to lean back against Caleb, even though every jolt of the horse made her want to. She didn't trust him. She didn't know him, but she'd made her choice, and she wasn't going to second-guess it now. "You got a name?" Caleb asked eventually. "Eliza Thorne." "Eliza," He said it like he was testing the weight of it. You always this reckless? Only when I don't have a choice. You had a choice back there. No, she said flatly. I didn't. He didn't argue. Maybe he understood. Maybe he didn't care. Either way, the silence returned, and Eliza was grateful for it. She wasn't ready to explain herself, to justify why she'd thrown her life away on a gamble this insane. By the time the sun started to set, they'd climbed high into the mountains. The trees were dense here, towering pines that blocked out most of the light. The trail was narrow and treacherous, winding through rocks and roots that would have thrown a less skilled rider. But Caleb moved through it like he'd been born in these woods, guiding the horse with barely a touch. Finally, they emerged into a clearing. A cabin stood at the center, rough-hewn logs, a stone chimney, windows shuttered tight against the coming night. It was small, isolated, and utterly removed from everything Eliza had ever known. Caleb dismounted first, then offered her a hand. She ignored it and slid down on her own, her legs stiff from the long ride. This is it, he said, nodding toward the cabin. It ain't much, but it's mine. Eliza looked around. The clearing was surrounded by forest on all sides, with no other signs of human life in sight. No neighbors, no road, no escape. Where's the nearest town? She asked. 2 days' ride south, 3 if the weather turns. Her stomach sank, but she kept her face neutral. And you live here alone? I did. She turned to look at him. So what's the arrangement here? You said you didn't want a wife. I don't. He started unsaddling the horse, his movements efficient and practiced. But you made an offer. Labor for shelter. I'll hold you to it. Fair enough. There's rules, he continued, not looking at her. You pull your weight or you leave. You don't touch my things without asking. You don't go wandering off into the woods alone. This land'll kill you faster than anything I could do. And you don't ask about my past. Eliza raised an eyebrow. That last one goes both ways? Yeah. Then we got a deal. He finally looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. You might regret this. I already regret a lot of things, she said. What's one more? For the first time, the corner of his mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Come on, I'll show you where you'll sleep. Bombed. The cabin was sparse. One room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting space. A ladder led up to a loft where Caleb slept. The only other furniture was a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and a fireplace built from river stones. You'll take the loft, Caleb said. I'll sleep down here. Eliza blinked. You're giving me your bed? It ain't much of a bed, just a pallet and some furs, but yeah. Why? Because I'm not a monster, he said simply. Whatever else you heard about me, I don't hurt women, and I don't take advantage. She studied him for a moment, trying to reconcile the rumors with the man standing in front of her. He was hard, yes, closed off. But there was something honorable buried beneath all that stone. All right, she said. Thank you. He nodded, then moved to light a fire. Within minutes, warmth began to fill the small space, pushing back the chill of the mountain night. Eliza climbed the ladder to inspect the loft. It was exactly as he'd described. A simple pallet made of straw and cloth, covered with thick furs that smelled faintly of wood smoke and wilderness. It wasn't comfortable, but it was clean. And it was hers. She sat down, her body finally catching up with everything that had happened. The adrenaline drained out of her all at once, leaving her hollow and exhausted. Below, she heard Caleb moving around, preparing something. Food, probably. The smell of frying meat drifted up, making her stomach growl. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. You coming down? He called. Yeah. She descended the ladder to find him setting out 2 tin plates, each with a thick slice of venison and a chunk of hard bread. It wasn't fancy, but it was more than she'd expected. They ate in silence. Eliza devoured her portion, too hungry to care about manners. Caleb watched her with that same unreadable expression, like he was cataloging every detail, filing it away for later. When she finished, she set down her plate and met his gaze. So what now? Now you sleep. Tomorrow we start. Start what? Teaching you how to survive out here. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed. You said you'd work. Well, there's plenty of work to be done. Wood to chop, water to haul, traps to check, garden to tend. Winter's coming, and we need to be ready. I can handle it. We'll see. There was no challenge in his tone, just a statement of fact. He wasn't trying to intimidate her or break her down. He was just being honest. And somehow, that made her respect him more than any bravado would have. One more thing, he said. You made a choice today. A big one. But if you wake up tomorrow and decide this was a mistake, I'll take you back to town. No questions asked. Eliza shook her head. I'm not going back. Not now, maybe, but later? Not ever, she said firmly. That place tried to sell me like cattle. I'd rather die out here than go back there. Caleb held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded. All right, then welcome to the mountain. The first week was hell. Eliza had thought she was strong. She'd worked hard her entire life, scrubbing floors, hauling water, tending to her father's endless needs. But nothing had prepared her for the sheer physical brutality of life in the wilderness. Caleb woke her before dawn every day, his voice cutting through the darkness like a knife. Get up, we're burning daylight. She stumbled down the ladder, bleary-eyed and aching, to find him already dressed and ready. He handed her a tin cup of black coffee, bitter and strong, and a piece of bread, then led her outside into the cold morning air. The work was relentless, chopping wood until her hands blistered and bled, hauling buckets of water from the stream until her shoulders screamed, checking traps scattered throughout the forest, learning to reset them without losing a finger, tending the small garden behind the cabin, pulling weeds and turning soil until her back felt like it would snap. And Caleb never slowed down. He moved through the tasks with a mechanical efficiency, his face hard and focused. He didn't offer encouragement or sympathy. He just worked and expected her to keep up. At first, she struggled. Her muscles weren't used to this kind of labor, and every night she collapsed into the loft, too exhausted to even think. But she refused to complain. She'd promised him she wouldn't, and she meant it. By the end of the second week, something shifted. Her body started to adapt. The blisters turned to calluses. The aches became familiar, almost comforting. She learned the rhythm of the work, the flow of the days. And slowly, she began to understand Caleb. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was to teach. He showed her how to read animal tracks, how to identify edible plants, how to tell when a storm was coming by the way the wind smelled. He was patient when she made mistakes, surprisingly so, though he never let her off easy. You're getting better, he said one afternoon as they worked side by side in the garden. Eliza paused, looking up at him. It was the first real compliment he'd given her, and she wasn't sure how to respond. Thanks, she said finally. He nodded, then went back to work. And that was that. But it mattered. More than she wanted to admit. Why? The nights were the hardest, not because of the cold, or the darkness, or the sounds of the forest pressing in around the cabin, but because of the silence. Caleb didn't talk after sundown. He ate his dinner, cleaned his plate, and then sat by the fire, staring into the flames like they held answers to questions he'd never ask aloud. Eliza would sit across from him, exhaustion weighing her down, and try to make sense of the man who'd taken her in. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't even unkind. But he was distant, like there was a wall between him and the rest of the world, a wall he had no intention of tearing down. One night, she finally broke the silence. Why'd you agree to bring me here? Caleb didn't look up from the fire. You asked. So? Plenty of people ask for things. That doesn't mean you give them. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, you reminded me of someone. Who? Doesn't matter, she's gone. Eliza waited, hoping he'd say more, but he didn't. The fire crackled, filling the space where words should have been. I'm sorry, she said softly. Don't be. You didn't do anything. Still. He finally looked at her, his dark eyes catching the firelight. You're nothing like her, really. She was softer, quieter, but you got the same look in your eyes, like you'd rather burn the world down than let it break you. Eliza didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Get some sleep, Caleb said, standing up. Tomorrow's going to be long. She climbed the ladder to the loft, her mind spinning. For the first time since she'd arrived, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she'd made the right choice. The third week brought the first real test. They were checking traps deep in the forest when Eliza heard it, a low, guttural growl that made the hair on the back of her neck stand up. Caleb froze. Don't move, What is it? She whispered. Bear. Her blood turned to ice. She'd heard stories about bears, about how they could tear a person apart in seconds. She'd never seen one, never wanted to. Caleb's hand moved slowly to the rifle slung across his back. Stay behind me. If I say run, you run. Don't look back. I'm not leaving you. Eliza, Bus? I'm not. He glanced at her, and for a moment something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or respect. Then he turned back to the trees, the rifle now in his hands. The bear emerged from the underbrush, a massive brown shape, all muscle and claws and primal hunger. It stood on its hind legs, roaring, the sound so loud it seemed to shake the ground. Caleb raised the rifle, his movement steady and calm. Easy, he murmured, though Eliza wasn't sure if he was talking to the bear or to himself. The bear dropped back onto all fours, its eyes locked on them. It huffed, sniffing the air, trying to decide if they were a threat or prey. Back away, Caleb said quietly. Slow. No sudden moves. Eliza obeyed, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Step by step they retreated, Caleb keeping the rifle trained on the bear the entire time. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear lost interest. It turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing as suddenly as it had appeared. Caleb lowered the rifle, letting out a breath. You all right? Yeah, Eliza said, though her hands were shaking. You? Yeah. They stood there for a moment, the adrenaline slowly draining away. Then Caleb looked at her, and something in his expression had changed. The wall wasn't gone, but it had cracked, just a little. You didn't run, he said. I told you I wouldn't. Most people would have. I'm not most people. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. No, you're not. And for the first time, Eliza felt like maybe, just maybe, she belonged here. Winter came fast and fierce. The first snow fell in late October, blanketing the mountains in white. The temperature dropped, and the work shifted, less about preparing for winter and more about surviving it. They spent long hours cutting firewood, stacking it high against the cabin walls. They hunted, bringing down a deer that would feed them for weeks. They sealed cracks in the cabin, stuffing them with moss and clay to keep out the wind. And through it all, the silence between them began to shift. Not into conversation exactly, but into something easier. A companionship born of necessity and respect. Eliza learned to read Caleb's moods, to know when he wanted to be left alone, and when he was open to talk. She learned that he was a man of few words, but when he spoke, it mattered. And Caleb, for his part, began to trust her. He taught her to shoot, to hunt, to move through the forest like a shadow. He showed her the hidden places on the mountain, caves and springs and overlooks where the view stretched for miles. One night, as they sat by the fire, Eliza asked the question she'd been holding back for weeks. What happened to you, Caleb? What made you come up here? He stiffened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, slowly, he spoke. I was married once. Had a family. A daughter. Eliza's breath caught. What happened? Men came. Bad men. They wanted my land, wanted me gone. I wasn't there when they came. By the time I got back, his voice broke just for a second. They were gone. All of them. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I hunted those men down. Every last one. And when I was done, I came here. Because I couldn't stand to be around people anymore. Couldn't stand the noise, the lies, the pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. Eliza reached out, her hand hovering over his for a moment before she let it fall. You're not alone anymore. He looked at her, his eyes dark and haunted. No, I guess I'm not. The end of the first month brought a fragile peace. Eliza had proven herself, not just as a worker, but as a partner. She pulled her weight, asked for nothing, and never complained. And in return, Caleb gave her something she'd never had before, respect. But beneath that peace, something else was growing. A tension that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with the two people trying to navigate a life neither of them had chosen. One night, as the fire burned low and the wind howled outside, Eliza looked across at Caleb and realized something that terrified her. She didn't want to leave, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because, for the first time in her life, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. And judging by the way Caleb looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, she suspected he felt the same way. But neither of them said it. Not yet. Because saying it would mean admitting that what had started as a transaction, shelter for labor, had become something else entirely. Something dangerous. Something real. The storm hit 3 days before Christmas. Not that they were counting. Time moved differently on the mountain, measured not by calendars but by the angle of the sun, the depth of the snow, the gnawing emptiness in your belly when supplies ran low. But Eliza had been keeping track in her head, scratching marks on a piece of bark she kept hidden in the loft. 23 days until the year turned. Not that it mattered, not really. The wind came first, howling down from the peaks like something alive and angry. It tore through the trees, bending them nearly double, sending branches crashing to the ground. Then came the snow, thick, heavy flakes that fell so fast the world disappeared behind a wall of white. Caleb stood at the window, his jaw tight. This is bad. Eliza joined him, wrapping her arms around herself against the cold that seeped through every crack in the cabin. How bad? Bad enough we might be stuck here for days. Maybe a week. He turned to her, his dark eyes serious. We need to check the animals, make sure they're secured. Come on. They'd built a small shelter for the horse and the 2 goats Caleb had traded for in the fall, lean and scrappy creatures that gave enough milk to make the effort worthwhile. The shelter was crude but solid, tucked against the side of the cabin where it caught some protection from the wind. I'll come with you, Eliza said. No, stay here. Keep the fire going. Caleb, Eliza. His tone left no room for argument. I've been through storms like this before. You haven't. If something happens to me out there, you need to be safe inside where you can wait it out. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she wasn't some fragile thing that needed protecting. But she saw the set of his shoulders, the way his hand unconsciously checked for the knife at his belt, and she understood. This wasn't about her being weak. This was about him needing to know she was safe so he could focus on what needed to be done. All right, she said. But if you're not back in 20 minutes, I'm coming after you. The corner of his mouth twitched. Fair enough. He pulled on his heavy coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and pushed out into the storm. The wind slammed the door shut behind him with a force that rattled the walls. Eliza stood there for a moment, listening to the howl of the wind, then turned to the fire. She added more wood, stirred the coals, and tried not to think about all the ways a man could die in weather like this. Frozen. Lost. Crushed by a falling tree. It would be so easy to step wrong, to lose your bearings in the whiteout, to wander off into the forest and never find your way back. She paced the small cabin, her nerves wound tight. 5 minutes. 10. 15. At 18 minutes, the door burst open and Caleb stumbled inside, covered in snow, his face red and raw from the cold. Animals are secure, he said, his breath coming in harsh gasps. But we're going to lose some firewood. Stacked by the north wall, collapsed. How much? Enough to matter. He shook the snow from his coat, his movements stiff. We'll have to ration what we've got inside, keep the fire lower than usual. Eliza felt a knot of worry in her stomach, but she pushed it down. We'll manage. Caleb looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. Then he nodded. Yeah, we will. The storm raged for 3 days. They huddled inside the cabin, keeping the fire just high enough to fight off the worst of the cold. The wind screamed outside, shaking the walls, finding every gap and crack to push icy fingers through. Snow piled against the door until Caleb had to force it open just to check that they weren't buried alive. The close quarters forced a new kind of intimacy between them. There was nowhere to hide, no space to retreat into solitude. They sat across from each other at the small table, sharing meals that grew smaller as their supplies dwindled. They took turns sleeping, one always awake to tend the fire, to make sure it didn't die and leave them at the mercy of the cold. And they talked. Not about anything important at first. Eliza told him about growing up in Blackwater Ridge, about the endless dust and the brutal summers, about the way the town felt like a cage she could never escape. Caleb told her about the mountain, about the animals that lived here, about the hard beauty of a place that didn't care whether you lived or died. But on the second night, when the wind was at its worst and the darkness pressed in around them, the conversation went deeper. You ever regret it? Caleb asked suddenly. Eliza looked up from the piece of leather she'd been mending, one of his gloves torn during the rush to secure the animals. Regret what? Coming here, leaving everything behind. She thought about it for a moment, really thought about it. No, she said finally. Not once. Even when it's this hard? Especially when it's this hard. She set down the glove, meeting his eyes across the flickering firelight. Back there I was dying. Not fast, not in any way people would notice, but dying all the same. Every day chipping away a little more until there'd be nothing left but an empty shell going through the motions. Here. She paused, searching for the right words. Here I'm alive. Even when I'm cold and hungry and so tired I can barely stand, I'm alive. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then, I understand that. Do you regret it? Bringing me here? No. The answer came quick and certain. You pull your weight, more than that. You don't complain, you don't make excuses. That's rare. That's not what I asked. He looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. I know. The air between them grew heavy with things unsaid. Eliza felt her heart beating faster, felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. This was dangerous territory, and they both knew it. They'd built something fragile here, something that worked precisely because they kept it simple, transactional. If they crossed that line. I should sleep, she said abruptly, standing up. It's my turn to rest. Caleb nodded, but his eyes followed her as she climbed the ladder to the loft, and she felt the heat of that gaze long after she'd wrapped herself in the furs and closed her eyes. On the third day, the storm broke. The wind died to a whisper, and the snow stopped falling. The world outside was buried under drifts that reached past the windows, but the sky was clear for the first time in what felt like forever. Caleb forced the door open, carving a path through the snow with the flat of a shovel. Eliza followed him out, blinking in the sudden brightness. Everything was white, blinding, pristine white that hurt to look at. The forest had been transformed into something alien and beautiful, the trees bent under the weight of the snow, their branches creating a delicate lattice against the blue sky. We need to dig out the woodpile, Caleb said, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air, and check the traps. Could be something caught, could be they're all buried. Either way, we need to know. They worked side by side, shoveling through the drifts, their muscles screaming from the effort. The cold was brutal, seeping through their clothes despite the layers, turning their fingers numb and clumsy. But they didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Survival didn't pause for exhaustion. It took them most of the day to dig out the woodpile. A good third of it had been scattered by the wind, half buried in snow and ice. They salvaged what they could, stacking it inside the cabin where it would stay dry. By the time the sun started to set, painting the snow in shades of pink and gold, they were both beyond exhausted. Eliza's arms felt like lead, and every breath burned in her lungs. That's enough for today, Caleb said, his voice rough. We'll check the traps tomorrow. They stumbled back inside, and Eliza collapsed into one of the chairs while Caleb built up the fire. The heat was glorious, driving away the bone-deep cold, bringing feeling back to her frozen hands and feet. Caleb handed her a cup of hot broth, thin, barely more than water flavored with the last scraps of dried meat. But it was warm, and that was all that mattered. You did good today, he said. Eliza looked up at him, surprised. Compliments from Caleb were rare, doled out only when earned. So did you. He sat down across from her, his own cup cradled in his large hands. Storm like that, it reminds you how fast things can go wrong. One mistake, one moment of bad luck, and he trailed off, staring into the fire. But we made it through, Eliza said, this time. There was something in his tone that made her chest tighten. What are you trying to say? Caleb was silent for a long moment. Then, you should know how to survive on your own, just in case. In case of what? In case something happens to me. Eliza set down her cup, anger flaring hot in her chest. Nothing's going to happen to you. You don't know that. Neither do you. Eliza. No. She stood up, her hands clenched into fists. You don't get to do this. You don't get to act like you're already gone, like you're just biding time until something kills you. We're in this together. That was the deal. The deal was shelter for labor. The deal changed. The words came out fierce, louder than she'd intended. It changed weeks ago, and you know it. Caleb stood too, his face hard. Nothing's changed. You're here because you've got nowhere else to go, and I'm here because I don't want to be anywhere else. That's all this is. Liar. His jaw tightened. Careful. Or what? You'll throw me out? Send me back to that town? We both know you won't. She stepped closer, refusing to back down even though he towered over her. You're scared. That's what this is. You're scared that if you admit this is more than a transaction, you'll lose it. Lose me. Just like you lost them. The moment the words left her mouth, she knew she'd gone too far. Caleb's face went pale, then flushed with anger. His hands clenched at his sides, and for a second she thought he might actually shout at her, might finally let out whatever it was he kept locked so tight inside. But he didn't. Instead, he turned and walked out of the cabin, slamming the door behind him. Eliza stood there, her heart pounding, regret already creeping in. She shouldn't have said that, shouldn't have thrown his pain in his face like a weapon, but the words had been there, sitting on her tongue for weeks, and they'd finally broken free. She sank back into the chair, her hands shaking. Outside, she could hear the crunch of his boots in the snow, pacing back and forth, working off the anger and hurt she'd caused. An hour passed, then 2. The fire burned low, and Eliza added more wood with mechanical precision, her mind spinning. Should she go after him? Apologize? Or give him space to process what she'd said? Finally, the door opened. Caleb stepped inside, his face carefully blank. He didn't look at her as he moved to the fire, holding his hands out to the flames. I'm sorry, Eliza said quietly. That was cruel. It was true. She waited, but he didn't say anything else. The silence stretched between them, thick and uncomfortable. Talk to me, she said finally. What do you want me to say? His voice was flat, emotionless. You're right. I am scared. I'm terrified that the moment I let myself care about someone again, they'll be ripped away. That's what happens. That's what always happens. Not always. Every time that's mattered. He turned to face her, and the raw pain in his eyes made her chest ache. You want to know why I came up here? Why I built this cabin in the middle of nowhere? Because I couldn't stand being around people who were alive when my family was dead. Couldn't stand their pity, their whispers, their endless questions. Couldn't stand waking up every day and remembering that I failed them. You didn't fail them, Eliza said. I wasn't there. His voice broke. They needed me, and I wasn't there. Eliza stood and crossed the small space between them. She reached out slowly, giving him time to pull away, and placed her hand over his. His skin was cold, rough with calluses and scars. You can't save everyone, she said softly. Sometimes bad things happen, and there's nothing you could have done to stop them. That doesn't make it your fault. Doesn't make it hurt any less. No, it doesn't. She squeezed his hand. But you're not alone anymore, and I'm not going anywhere. Caleb looked down at their joined hands, something conflicted in his expression. You can't promise that. Yes, I can, and I am. She took a breath, steadying herself. I know what this is, Caleb. I know it started as a deal, a way for both of us to survive. But it's not that anymore. At least not for me. And I don't think it is for you either. He was quiet for a long time. Then slowly, his fingers curled around hers, holding on like she was the only thing keeping him anchored to the earth. I don't know how to do this, he said finally. Don't know how to let someone in without waiting for them to leave. Then we figure it out together, one day at a time. He nodded, and for the first time since she'd known him, the hard mask he wore cracked wide open. What she saw underneath wasn't weakness. It was courage. The courage it took to try again after everything had been taken from you. The weeks that followed were different, not in any obvious way. They still worked from dawn to dusk, still spoke more through actions than words. But something fundamental had shifted. The walls between them were coming down, brick by careful brick. Caleb taught her to hunt, taking her deep into the forest where they tracked deer through the snow. He showed her how to move silently, how to read the signs the animals left behind, how to make the kill clean and quick. When she brought down her first buck, a clean shot to the heart, he actually smiled, a real smile that transformed his entire face. You're a natural, he said, clapping her on the shoulder. Eliza felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. Had a good teacher, They butchered the deer together, working in companionable silence, their hands stained red with blood and effort. It was hard, messy work, but satisfying in a primal way. This meat would feed them for weeks, maybe a month if they rationed it right. That night, they feasted. Real meat, cooked over the fire until it was tender and smoky, served with the last of their root vegetables. It was the best meal Eliza had eaten in months. To survival, Caleb said, raising his tin cup. Eliza clinked hers against his. To partnership. His eyes met hers, and something passed between them, an understanding and acknowledgement of what they were building together. To partnership, he repeated. January brought a cold snap that made the previous storm seem gentle. The temperature plummeted so low that the water in their bucket froze solid overnight. They burned through firewood at an alarming rate, and Caleb's face grew tight with worry every time he checked their dwindling supply. "We're going to have to go down the mountain," he said one morning. "Trade for supplies, flour, salt, ammunition, things we can't make or find up here." Eliza felt a jolt of something, not quite fear, but close. To Blackwater Ridge? No. There's another town, smaller, 2 days south. They know me there. He paused. They know what I am, and they don't care as long as I pay. What do we have to trade? Furs, meat if it stays cold enough during the journey. He looked at her. You don't have to come. Might be safer if you stay here. I'm coming. Eliza, I'm not staying here alone for 4 days, Caleb. What if something happens? What if the cabin catches fire, or another storm hits, or... She trailed off, not wanting to voice all the fears that crowded her mind. I'm coming. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. All right, but you do exactly as I say when we're in town. Don't talk to anyone unless I tell you it's safe. Don't wander off. And if I say we're leaving, we leave. No questions. Understood. They spent 2 days preparing. Caleb bundled the best furs into a pack, fox, beaver, and one beautiful wolf pelt that Eliza had helped him cure. They loaded the horse with supplies, packed light because the animal would need its strength for the journey. On the 3rd day, they set out. The trip down the mountain was brutal. The trails were treacherous with ice, and more than once the horse nearly lost its footing. They moved slowly, carefully, Caleb in the lead with Eliza close behind. They made camp the first night in a small cave Caleb knew, building a fire near the entrance to ward off the cold and any predators. They ate dried meat and hard bread, huddled close to the flames. Tell me about this town, Eliza said. Not much to tell. It's called Cedar Falls. Maybe 200 people. They're not friendly exactly, but they mind their own business. That's all that matters. And they know you? Some do. I've been trading there for 3 years. He poked at the fire with a stick. They think I'm crazy for living up here alone. Let them think it. Keeps them from asking questions. Eliza watched the flames dance, her mind working. What will they think when they see me? That I'm even crazier than they thought. He glanced at her. Or that I finally got lonely enough to buy myself a wife. Is that what you want them to think? I want them to think whatever keeps them from bothering us. He shifted, his expression serious. But if anyone gives you trouble, you tell me. Immediately. I can handle trouble. I know you can. But you shouldn't have to. The next day they reached Cedar Falls. It was small, like Caleb had said. A collection of rough buildings clustered around a main street. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of hammering echoed from somewhere nearby. People stopped and stared as they rode in. Eliza felt the weight of their gazes, the whispers that followed in their wake. She kept her spine straight, her chin up, refusing to show any hint of fear or shame. Caleb led them to the trading post, a squat building with a faded sign that read, Morrison's Goods. He dismounted and helped Eliza down, his hand lingering on her waist for just a moment longer than necessary. Stay close, he murmured. Inside, the trading post was dim and cluttered, shelves packed with everything from bolts of cloth to bags of flour to firearms. A man stood behind the counter, middle-aged, balding, with shrewd eyes that missed nothing. Caleb Voss, the man said, his tone neutral. Been a while. Morrison. Caleb set the pack of furs on the counter. Got trade. Morrison pulled out the furs one by one, examining them with a practiced eye. He nodded approvingly at the wolf pelt. This is good work. You do the curing? We did. Caleb said, emphasizing the word. Morson's gaze flicked to Eliza, then back to Caleb. That's so. That's so. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. Morson studied Eliza for a long moment, and she met his gaze without flinching. Well then, Morrison said finally. Let's talk terms. They haggled for 20 minutes. Caleb was hard-nosed and stubborn, refusing to accept anything less than fair value. Morrison pushed back, but there was a grudging respect in his eyes. Finally, they settled on a price. Enough flour, salt, coffee, and ammunition to last until spring, plus a bolt of heavy wool fabric that Caleb said Eliza could use to make a proper winter coat. As Morrison packed their supplies, a woman entered the trading post. She was younger than Morrison, maybe 40, with tired eyes and work-worn hands. She looked at Eliza with something that might have been sympathy. You his wife? She asked bluntly. Yes, Eliza said, the lie coming easily. It was simpler than explaining the truth. The woman nodded. You need anything, clothes, medicine, just someone to talk to, you come find me. Name's Sarah Morrison. I'm the shopkeeper's sister. Thank you, Eliza said, surprised by the kindness. Sarah leaned in closer, lowering her voice. I know what it's like being alone up there. If you ever need help, you send word. Before Eliza could respond, Caleb was at her side, his hand on her elbow. We should go. They loaded the supplies onto the horse and left town quickly, not stopping until they were well into the forest. Only then did Caleb relax, his shoulders losing some of their tension. What was that about? Eliza asked. What? That woman, Sarah, she seemed worried about me. Caleb was quiet for a moment. People see what they want to see. They see a young woman with a mountain recluse, and they assume the worst. And what is the worst? That I'm keeping you against your will, that I'm cruel or violent or... He trailed off, jaw tight. But you're not. No. But reputation doesn't care about truth. He looked at her. Does it bother you? What they think? Eliza considered it. Back in Blackwater Ridge, she would have cared desperately what people thought. But that was before. Before she'd learned what it meant to rely on herself, to build something from nothing. No, she said. Let them think what they want. We know the truth. Caleb's expression softened. Yeah, we do. They made it back to the cabin just as another storm rolled in, bringing with it fresh snow and howling winds. But this time, they were prepared. They had supplies, they had each other, and they had something that felt dangerously close to hope. That night, after they'd unloaded everything and secured the animals, they sat by the fire sharing a meal. The wind rattled the walls, but inside it was warm and safe. Thank you, Eliza said suddenly. Caleb looked up. For what? For taking me with you, for not making me stay behind. You're my partner. Partners stick together. It was such a simple statement, but it meant everything. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes, and she blinked them away quickly. She wasn't the crying type. Never had been. But Caleb saw anyway. He always saw. He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. You all right? Yeah, she said, her voice thick. I'm all right. Better than all right. They sat like that for a long time, hands joined, the fire crackling between them. And for the first time since she'd left Blackwater Ridge, Eliza felt something she'd almost forgotten existed. She felt like she was home. February arrived with a deceptive calm. The storms paused, leaving behind a landscape so pristine it hurt to look at. The sun returned, weak but persistent, turning the snow into fields of scattered diamonds. For 3 weeks, the mountain breathed easy, and so did they. Eliza had never known peace like this. Not the absence of noise or chaos, but something deeper, a settling of the soul that came from waking up each morning and knowing exactly where you belonged. She and Caleb moved through their days with an easy rhythm now, two parts of a whole that functioned better together than either had alone. She was chopping wood behind the cabin when she heard the horses. At first she thought it was just the wind playing tricks, carrying sounds from some distant valley. But then she heard it again. The unmistakable sound of hooves crunching through snow, multiple animals moving together with purpose. Caleb heard it too. He emerged from the cabin, rifle already in his hands, his face hard. Get inside, he said quietly. Who is it? Don't know, but nobody rides up here without a reason, and most reasons ain't good. He moved toward her, positioning himself between her and the tree line where the sounds were coming from. Inside now. Eliza wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't the time. She hurried into the cabin but stayed near the window, peering out through the gap in the shutters. 4 riders emerged from the forest. They were rough-looking men, the kind who wore their violence like a second skin. The leader was tall and lean, with a face like weathered leather and eyes that swept over everything with cold calculation. The others flanked him, one broad and brutal-looking, another younger with a mean twist to his mouth, and the last older, scarred, with the look of someone who'd survived too many fights through sheer meanness. They stopped 20 feet from where Caleb stood. The leader smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "Caleb Voss," the man said. "Been looking for you. Found me." Caleb's voice was flat, emotionless. "Now you can leave." "Not that simple." The leader shifted in his saddle, making a show of getting comfortable. "Name's Dutch Harker. I work for Mr. Garrett Blackwood. You heard of him?" "No." "Well, that's about to change." Dutch's smile widened. "Mr. Blackwood's a businessman. He acquires land, develops it, makes it profitable. And he's got his eye on this mountain. Not for sale." "Everything's for sale, friend. Just a matter of price." Dutch gestured at the cabin, the clearing, the forest beyond. "This is prime timberland. Got good water, good access once a proper road's cut. Mr. Blackwood's willing to pay fair value. And if I'm not willing to sell, then Mr. Blackwood would be disappointed." Dutch's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath. "He's not a man who handles disappointment well." Inside the cabin, Eliza felt her stomach twist. She'd heard stories about men like this, about land barons who came in and took what they wanted, legal or not. They operated in the spaces where law was scarce and consequences even scarcer. "You tell Mr. Blackwood he can be disappointed all he wants," Caleb said. "This land's mine. Got the deed registered and everything. It's not going anywhere." "See, that's the thing about deeds." Dutch leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Paper burns real easy, and accidents happen all the time out here in the wilderness. Fires, avalanches, wild animals." He let the implications hang in the air. "Be a shame if something happened to a man living all alone out here." "I'm not alone." Dutch's eyes flicked toward the cabin, and his smile took on a predatory edge. "That's so. Well then, we wouldn't want anything happening to your companion either." The temperature in Caleb's voice dropped to sub-zero. "You threaten her again, and I'll put a bullet in you before you finish the sentence." "Easy now." Dutch held up his hands in mock surrender. "Nobody's threatening anybody. We're just having a conversation, exploring options." He pulled a piece of paper from his coat. "Mr. Blackwood's authorized me to offer you $5,000. That's more than fair for land this remote." "Not interested." "7,000. "No." "10,000, and that's final." Dutch's patience was clearly wearing thin. "That's a fortune, Voss. Enough to buy yourself a nice place down in civilization, live comfortable for years. What's keeping you up here in this frozen hell anyway? Pride? Principle." Dutch laughed, but it was a harsh sound. "Principle. That's rich." He folded the paper and tucked it back in his coat. "I'll tell you what's going to happen. I'm going to ride back down this mountain and tell Mr. Blackwood you're being unreasonable. He's going to send me back with a different offer, and you're going to take it because the alternative..." He shrugged. "Well, let's just say Mr. Blackwood gets what he wants, one way or another. Then I guess he's about to learn what disappointment feels like." The two men stared at each other, the tension so thick Eliza could feel it through the cabin wall. Finally, Dutch nodded slowly. "Have it your way. But don't say I didn't warn you." He turned his horse. "Let's go, boys." The 4 riders disappeared back into the forest, but their presence lingered like smoke. Caleb stood there for a long time, the rifle still in his hands, watching the tree line. Eliza came out slowly. "Caleb." "Pack supplies," he said, his voice clipped. "Food, water, blankets, enough for 3 days." "What? Why?" "Because if they come back, and they will come back, we need to be ready to leave fast." He turned to her, his face grim. Men like that don't make threats they're not willing to follow through on. And they sure as hell don't take no for an answer. So we just run. We survive. There's a difference. He moved toward the cabin, his movements quick and efficient. There's a cave system about 5 miles north. Defensible, hidden. We can hold out there if we have to. Eliza felt anger flare in her chest. This is your land, your home. Why should you have to run? Because staying here and dying to prove a point is stupid, and I didn't survive this long by being stupid. He stopped at the door looking back at her. I know it's not fair. I know it's not right. But fair and right don't mean much when you're dead. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him they should fight, should stand their ground. But she saw the weight in his eyes, the memory of other fights, other losses. He'd lost everything once before trying to protect what was his. He wouldn't make that mistake again. All right, she said. We'll be ready. The next 2 days were tense. They went through their routines, checking traps, tending the animals, maintaining the cabin, but everything felt brittle, like they were walking on ice that could crack at any moment. Caleb barely slept, spending most nights sitting by the window with his rifle across his knees, watching the darkness. Eliza tried to stay busy, tried not to think about what might be coming, but her mind kept circling back to Dutch Harker's cold smile, the casual way he'd talked about violence like it was just another tool in his kit. On the third night, Caleb finally spoke about it. I need you to know something, he said, staring into the fire. If they come back, if things go bad, you run. You take the horse and you ride for Cedar Falls. Find Sarah Morrison. Tell her what happened. She'll help you. I'm not leaving you. Eliza, no. She moved to sit beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. We're partners, remember? Partners don't abandon each other when things get hard. This isn't hard. This is dangerous. These aren't men who'll show mercy just because you're a woman. I know that. She looked at him, her jaw set. And I'm still not leaving. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then, you're the most stubborn person I've ever met. Takes one to know one. Despite everything, he smiled. It was small and fleeting, but it was there. All right, but if I tell you to run, you run. Promise me. I promise I'll consider it. Eliza, that's the best you're getting. He shook his head, but there was something almost affectionate in the gesture. Fair enough. They sat there together as the fire burned down to embers, neither one willing to break the silence. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the trees. It sounded like a warning. Dutch Harker and his men came back a week later. This time there were 6 of them, and they didn't bother with pleasantries. They rode into the clearing at mid-morning, spreading out in a loose semicircle that blocked any easy escape route. Dutch sat in the center, that same cold smile on his face. Mr. Blackwood's final offer, he called out. $15,000 and safe passage out of here. You've got 1 minute to decide. Caleb stood on the porch, rifle in hand. Eliza was inside, watching through the window, with her heart hammering against her ribs. They'd talked about this, planned for it. But planning and facing it were 2 different things. Same answer as before, Caleb said. No. Dutch sighed like he was dealing with a particularly stubborn child. That's unfortunate. See, Mr. Blackwood, he's a patient man. But even his patience has limits. He told me if you said no again, I was authorized to encourage you to reconsider. And how do you plan to do that? Well, Dutch glanced at his men. We could start with your animals. That's a nice horse you got. Be a shame if something happened to it. Or those goats. I hear goat meat's pretty tough, but when you're hungry enough, touch my animals and I'll drop you where you sit. You could try. Dutch's smile never wavered. But there's 6 of us and 1 of you. Even if you get off a shot, and that's a big if, you'd be dead before you could reload. Then where would that leave your pretty little companion? Inside the cabin, Eliza felt ice slide down her spine. She'd heard enough. These men weren't here to negotiate. They were here to take what they wanted, and they'd kill anyone who got in their way. She looked around the cabin, her mind racing. They couldn't fight 6 armed men head-on, but maybe they didn't have to. Her eyes landed on the lamp oil. They had 3 jars of it, carefully hoarded for the long winter nights. Highly flammable. Highly useful. An idea began to form. Outside, the standoff continued. Dutch was still talking, his voice taking on an edge of impatience. Last chance, Voss. Take the money and walk away. Or we take the land anyway, and you don't walk anywhere ever again. Go to hell. Wrong answer. Dutch nodded to his men. Burn the barn. Let's see how tough he is when his animals are screaming. Two of the men dismounted and started toward the small structure where the horse and goats were sheltered. Caleb shifted, raising the rifle, but Dutch was right. He could maybe get one shot off before the others cut him down. That's when Eliza made her move. She grabbed one of the jars of lamp oil, wrapped it in a rag, and lit the rag from the fireplace. Then she kicked open the cabin door and hurled it with everything she had. The jar arced through the air and smashed against the ground right in front of the two men heading for the barn. The oil ignited in a wall of flame, driving them back with shouts of surprise and fear. "Get away from our home!" Eliza shouted, already grabbing the second jar. The distraction was exactly what Caleb needed. He fired, and one of the mounted men went down with a scream, clutching his shoulder. The other riders scattered, their horses spooked by the sudden violence. Dutch wheeled his horse around, his face twisted with rage. "You little—" Eliza threw the second jar. This one hit one of the riders square in the chest, shattering and soaking his coat with oil. He panicked, trying to brush it off, but a spark from the first fire caught, and suddenly he was ablaze. His screams cut through the air as he threw himself from his horse and rolled in the snow. Chaos erupted. The horses were in full panic now, bucking and kicking. Two of Dutch's men were occupied with their burning companion, trying to smother the flames. The one Caleb had shot was still down, groaning. "Inside!" Caleb shouted at Eliza. But she'd already grabbed the rifle from above the door, an older weapon Caleb kept as a backup. She didn't have time to aim properly, just pointed it in the general direction of Dutch Harker and pulled the trigger. The recoil nearly knocked her down, and she missed by a mile. But the shot was close enough to make Dutch's horse rear. He fought for control, cursing. "Fall back!" he roared at his remaining men. "Fall back!" They retreated, dragging their wounded with them, disappearing into the tree line. But Eliza knew it wasn't over, not by a long shot. Caleb grabbed her arm, pulling her inside the cabin. "What the hell were you thinking?" "I was thinking we were about to die." She was shaking now, the adrenaline making her hands tremble. "I was thinking we needed a distraction. You could have been killed. So could you." She yanked her arm free, her eyes blazing. "I told you I wasn't going to let you face this alone." They stared at each other, both breathing hard. Then, to her surprise, Caleb laughed. It was a harsh, slightly unhinged sound, but it was genuine. "You threw lamp oil at armed men," he said. "That's either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest. Can it be both?" "Yeah, I guess it can." He pulled her into a brief, tight hug. "Don't ever do that again." "Can't promise that." He pulled back, his expression serious now. "They'll be back, and next time they'll be ready for tricks. So what do? We finish packing, we fortify, and we prepare for a siege." He moved to the window, checking the tree line. "Because Dutch Harker struck me as the kind of man who doesn't let humiliation go unanswered." They worked through the day and into the night, boarding up windows, stacking supplies near the door, loading every weapon they had. Caleb showed Eliza how to reload the rifles quickly, how to make every shot count. They filled buckets with snow, positioned them around the cabin in case of fire. As darkness fell, they ate a cold meal, not daring to light more than the smallest fire. Every sound from outside made them tense, every shadow a potential threat. "Tell me something," Eliza said, breaking the silence. "If you could go back before I showed up in Blackwater Ridge, would you?" Caleb considered it. "You mean, would I choose to be alone again, knowing what's coming?" "Yeah." "No." The answer came without hesitation. "These last few months, they've been the first time I've felt alive since before. Even with all this, even knowing what we're facing, I wouldn't trade it." Eliza felt something warm bloom in her chest, pushing back the fear. "Me neither." He reached across the small space between them and took her hand. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you need to know you made this place a home again. Made me remember what that felt like." "Caleb, let me finish." His grip tightened. "I was dead before you showed up. Just breathing, just going through the motions. But you reminded me why any of it matters. Why it's worth fighting for." Eliza felt tears prick her eyes. "We're going to get through this. Both of us." "Yeah." He nodded, like he was trying to convince himself. Yeah, we are. They stayed up through the night, taking turns watching, dozing in shifts. The forest remained quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that felt wrong, too still, too tense, like the whole mountain was holding its breath. Dawn broke gray and cold. Still no sign of Dutch and his men. Maybe they gave up, Eliza said, though she didn't believe it. Maybe. Caleb didn't believe it either. They were on their third cup of weak coffee when they heard it, the sound of many horses more than before. Caleb moved to the window and his face went pale. How many? Eliza asked. 12, maybe 15. He grabbed his rifle. Dutch brought reinforcements. This time the men didn't bother with threats or negotiations. They spread out in a wide circle around the cabin, just beyond rifle range. Dutch sat at the center, and even from a distance Eliza could see the fury on his face. Caleb Voss, he shouted. You've had your fun. Now it's our turn. What do we do? Eliza whispered. Caleb's jaw was tight. We hold. Make every shot count. Make it too expensive for them to take. And if that's not enough? He looked at her and she saw everything in his eyes, fear, determination, and something deeper. Then we go down fighting, together. Eliza nodded. She moved to the other window, rifle ready. Her hands were steady now, the fear burned away by a cold clarity. She'd meant what she said. She wasn't leaving, not him, not this place they'd built together. If Dutch Harker wanted this land, he was going to have to kill them both to get it. Fire! Dutch's command rang out. The first volley of shots smashed into the cabin. Wood splintered, glass shattered. Eliza ducked below the window, her heart racing but her mind clear. Caleb fired back, his shot precise. One of the riders jerked and fell from his horse. Make them pay for every inch, he shouted. Eliza popped up, sighted down the barrel, and squeezed the trigger. She hit a man in the leg and he went down screaming. She ducked again as return fire splintered the wood where her head had been. The siege had begun. For hours they fought, the cabin filled with smoke and noise. Eliza's ears rang from the gunfire. Her shoulder ached from the recoil, but she kept shooting, kept loading, kept fighting. Dutch's men tried to rush the cabin twice. Both times, Caleb's accurate fire drove them back, leaving bodies in the snow. But ammunition was running low. Eliza could see it in Caleb's face, the grim calculation of bullets remaining versus enemies still standing. We can't hold much longer, he said during a lull in the fighting. Then we make a run for it. The cave you mentioned. They'll hunt us down. Better than dying here like trapped animals. Caleb started to respond, but the words died on his lips. His eyes widened, focused on something beyond her shoulder. Eliza turned and saw smoke. Thick, black smoke pouring from the back of the cabin. They set a fire, Caleb said, his voice hollow. We're out of time. The smoke poured through the cracks in the back wall like living darkness, thick and choking. Eliza grabbed a cloth, dunked it in the water bucket, and pressed it to her face. Caleb did the same, his eyes streaming as the cabin filled with acrid fumes. The front's our only way out, he shouted over the crackling of flames. They'll be waiting for us. Then we give them something they're not expecting. Eliza moved to the supplies they'd packed for the cave, pulling out one of the blankets. She soaked it in water, then wrapped it around her shoulders. We go out fighting. Make them scatter, get to the horses, and run. That's suicide. Staying here is suicide. She grabbed his arm, forcing him to look at her through the thickening smoke. We didn't survive this long to burn alive, Caleb. We fight or we die. Choose. For a heartbeat, she saw the old pain in his eyes, the memory of another fire, another loss. Then something hardened in his expression, something fierce and unbreakable. We fight, he said. They positioned themselves on either side of the door. Caleb kicked it open and immediately fired, dropping one of Dutch's men who'd gotten too close. Eliza dove through right after, rolling in the snow to extinguish any sparks that had caught on her wet blanket. Bullets kicked up snow around her. She came up firing, not bothering to aim carefully, just laying down cover as Caleb charged out behind her. The wet blanket over his shoulders smoked where embers had caught, but he didn't slow down. "The barn!" he shouted. They ran. Dutch's men, caught off guard by the sudden offensive, hesitated just long enough. Bullets whined past, one so close Eliza felt the displacement of air against her cheek, but they made it to the small structure where their animals were sheltered. The horse was panicked, wild-eyed from the smoke and gunfire. Caleb grabbed its halter, speaking in low, urgent tones that somehow cut through the chaos. The animal settled just enough for him to throw a saddle on its back. "Get on!" he ordered Eliza. She hauled herself up as another volley of shots tore through the barn's thin walls. Caleb swung up behind her, one arm around her waist, the other raising his rifle for one last shot. He fired, and Dutch Harker's hat flew off his head. Not a killing shot, but close enough to make a point. Then Caleb dug his heels into the horse's flanks, and they exploded out of the barn at a full gallop. The world became a blur of white snow and dark trees and the thunder of hooves. Behind them, men shouted and more shots rang out, but they were moving too fast, the forest swallowing them up. Eliza clung to the horse's mane, her body pressed against its neck as branches whipped past. Caleb guided them with expert precision through terrain that would have killed most riders, taking paths only someone who knew this mountain intimately could follow. They rode for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, climbing higher into the mountains where the snow grew deeper and the trees more dense. Finally, Caleb pulled the horse to a stop in a small clearing, listening intently. The forest was silent except for their ragged breathing and the horse's labored pants. "Did we lose them?" Eliza asked. "For now. But they'll track us once they regroup." Caleb dismounted, then helped her down. "The cave's another 2 miles north. We need to move on foot from here. Ground's too rocky for the horse to keep pace without breaking a leg." They walked quickly, Caleb leading the horse by the reins. The cold was brutal this high up, seeping through their clothes despite their exertion. Eliza's lungs burned with each breath, but she pushed forward. Behind them, faint but growing louder, came the sound of pursuit. "They're coming," Caleb said grimly. "Move faster." The terrain grew increasingly treacherous. They were scrambling over rocks now, navigating narrow ledges with drops that disappeared into darkness. The horse balked at a particularly steep section, and Caleb made a decision that clearly tore at him. "We have to leave him," he said, his voice thick. "He can't make it up this way." Eliza saw the pain in his face. That horse had been his companion for years, long before she'd arrived. "Caleb, go, I'll catch up." He grabbed the rifle from the saddle, ammunition, and the pack of supplies. Then he slapped the horse's flank, sending it galloping back the way they'd come. "Run, boy! Go!" The animal disappeared into the forest. With any luck, it would lead their pursuers astray, at least for a while. Caleb turned to Eliza, his face set. "The cave. Now." They climbed. Eliza's hands were numb, her legs shaking with exhaustion, but she didn't slow down. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew closer, men shouting, the clatter of rocks being disturbed. Just when she thought she couldn't go another step, Caleb grabbed her arm and pulled her toward what looked like a solid rock face. But as they got closer, she saw the opening, a narrow crack barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "In," Caleb ordered. Eliza wedged herself into the gap, the stone scraping against her shoulders. It was pitch black inside, and she had to fight down a surge of panic as the walls pressed close on all sides. Then suddenly the passage opened up, and she stumbled into a larger space. Caleb came through right behind her, dragging the supplies. He immediately moved back to the entrance, positioning himself where he could see out but remain hidden. "How defensible is this?" Eliza whispered. "Very. Only one way in, and it's too narrow for more than one man at a time." His voice was grim. "But that also means only one way out." They waited in the darkness, listening. Eliza's eyes slowly adjusted, helped by the thin shaft of daylight that filtered through the entrance. The cave was bigger than she'd expected, the ceiling high enough to stand upright, the space extending back into shadows she couldn't penetrate. Outside, the voices grew louder. "Tracks lead this way," someone shouted. "Spread out. They can't have gone far." Caleb pressed himself against the rock, rifle ready. Eliza crouched beside him, her own weapon loaded and waiting. Her heart hammered so hard she was sure it would give them away. A man appeared at the entrance, one of Dutch's crew, his face red from exertion. He peered into the darkness, trying to see past the narrow opening. "Think they went in here?" he called back to someone. "Only one way to find out," came the reply. "Go check." The man hesitated, clearly not liking the idea of squeezing into a dark, unknown space. But he started forward, his rifle extended in front of him. He made it 3 steps into the passage before Caleb moved. In one fluid motion, he grabbed the rifle barrel, yanked it forward, and used the momentum to slam the man's head against the rock wall. The man crumpled without a sound. "Hendricks?" someone called from outside. "You all right?" Caleb and Eliza froze. Silence stretched, taut as a wire. Then Dutch Harker's voice, sharp and angry. "Hendricks, answer me!" Still nothing. "They're in there," Dutch said. "Got to be. Martinez, you and Cole go in after them." "The hell with that," someone responded. "You see how narrow that opening is? We'd be sitting ducks." "Then we wait them out. They got no food, no water. Winter night at this elevation will freeze them solid. We just camp here and collect the bodies in the morning." Eliza met Caleb's eyes in the dim light. He was thinking the same thing she was. Dutch was right. They couldn't stay here indefinitely. But before either of them could speak, a new sound cut through the air. Distant but unmistakable. Gunfire. A lot of it. And it was coming from the direction of the cabin. Dutch's men heard it too. "What the hell?" one of them muttered. "Boss, that sounds like—" "I know what it sounds like," Dutch snapped. "Martinez, Cole, get back down there. Find out what's happening." "What about these two?" "Leave Williams and Carter here to keep watch. If they try to come out, shoot them. Everyone else. With me." The sounds of departure faded, leaving only two men outside the cave. Eliza could hear them settling in, the crunch of snow as they found positions to watch the entrance. "What do you think that was?" she whispered. Caleb shook his head. "Don't know, but it bought us time." He moved deeper into the cave, gesturing for her to follow. "There might be another way out. Caves like this sometimes have multiple passages." They felt their way through the darkness, hands trailing along the cold stone walls. The cave narrowed, then opened up again into another chamber. Water dripped somewhere in the blackness, echoing off unseen walls. "Wait," Caleb said suddenly. "You feel that?" Eliza stood still, focusing. There, a faint current of air, cold and fresh. "Airflow, that means—" "Another opening." Hope colored his voice for the first time since the siege began. "Come on." They followed the air current, moving carefully through the darkness. Once, Eliza's foot slipped on wet stone, and Caleb caught her, his grip strong and steady. The passage twisted, descended, then suddenly opened onto a ledge overlooking a steep drop. And there, 30 feet below, was the forest. "We can climb down," Eliza said, studying the rock face. It was rough, with plenty of handholds, but treacherous with ice. "It'll be dangerous. Less dangerous than staying here." Caleb looked back the way they'd come. "Those men outside the front entrance won't know we've left until it's too late." They made their way down carefully, testing each handhold before trusting their weight to it. Halfway down, Eliza's hand closed on a piece of rock that crumbled away. She gasped, her feet scrambling for purchase, but Caleb was there, his arm shooting out to steady her. "I've got you," he said. "Keep going." They reached the bottom just as the sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and red. Eliza's arms shook from the strain, and her hands were raw and bleeding. "Which way now?" she asked. Caleb oriented himself, checking the position of the sun and the lay of the land. "Cedar Falls. It's our only option. We need help, supplies, and distance from Dutch's men. That's 2 days' travel on foot in this cold. You have a better idea?" She didn't. They started walking, moving as quickly as the terrain and their exhaustion would allow. As darkness fell, the temperature plummeted. They couldn't risk a fire, too visible, so they found shelter under a rock overhang and huddled together for warmth. Eliza had never been so cold in her life. It was the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, that made every breath painful, that made you want to just close your eyes and sleep. She knew that was death talking, knew that if she gave in to that urge, she'd never wake up. Caleb wrapped his arms around her, sharing what little body heat they had. "Stay awake," he murmured against her hair. "Talk to me. Tell me something. Anything." "Like what?" "What would you do? If we get through this? If we survive?" Eliza thought about it. "Build a new cabin, bigger this time, with a real window, not just shutters, and a porch where we could sit in the summer and watch the sunset." "We?" She felt her cheeks warm despite the cold. "Yeah, we. Unless, if you don't want, I want." His arms tightened around her. I want that more than I've wanted anything in a long time. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the wind howl through the trees. Then Caleb spoke again, his voice barely audible. I was angry when my family died. Angry at everything. The men who killed them, the world that let it happen, myself for not being there. That anger kept me alive, gave me purpose. But it was killing me too, just slower. Until you showed up and reminded me there's more to life than rage and survival. Caleb, let me finish. He took a breath. You make me want to live, not just survive. You make me want to build something, to believe there's a future worth fighting for. And if we get through this, if we make it to Cedar Falls and find a way to end this, I want... He paused, searching for the words. I want what you want. The cabin, the porch, all of it. With you. Eliza turned in his arms so she could see his face in the dim starlight. Promise me something. Anything. Promise me you'll fight to survive. Not just for me, but for yourself. For the life we could have. I promise. She kissed him then, her lips cold against his, but the intention warm. It was brief, almost chaste, but it held everything they'd been too afraid or too busy to say. When she pulled back, she saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Not just hope, but joy. We should rest, he said softly. We've got a long walk tomorrow. They took turns sleeping, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, through the long, brutal night. When dawn finally came, gray and cold, they started walking again. The first day was hell. They had no food except a handful of dried meat Caleb had managed to grab from the supplies. No water except what they could melt from snow. Their clothes were inadequate for this kind of cold, and every step was a battle against exhaustion. But they kept moving. By late afternoon, Eliza's vision had started to blur. She stumbled over nothing, caught herself, kept going. Caleb wasn't much better. She could see the strain in every movement, the way he favored his left leg where an old injury had started acting up. How much further? She asked, her voice hoarse. If we've been moving in the right direction, maybe half a day. He glanced at the sky, worry creasing his face. But there's another storm coming. We need to find shelter soon. They pushed on as the light faded and the first flakes of snow began to fall. Within an hour, the storm was in full force, not as bad as the one that had trapped them in the cabin weeks ago, but bad enough. There, Caleb pointed to a cluster of thick pines. We can shelter under those until it passes. They huddled beneath the dense branches, which provided some protection from the wind and snow. Eliza's teeth chattered so hard she bit her tongue, tasting blood. Caleb pulled her close, wrapping them both in the single blanket they'd managed to salvage. Tell me about the cabin again, he said. The one we're going to build. You start, she managed through her shivers. All right, it'll be on the south side of the mountain, where it catches the sun. 2 rooms, one for us, one for storage. And a real bed, not just a pallet, with a mattress and everything. A kitchen, Eliza added, her mind clinging to the vision like a lifeline. With a proper stove, and shelves for all the preserves we'll put up in summer. A barn for the animals, bigger than the one we had, and a workshop where I can do repairs without freezing to death. A garden, a big one, with vegetables and herbs and maybe some flowers just because they're pretty. They built the cabin piece by piece in words, making it real through sheer force of will. And somehow, impossibly, Eliza felt warmer. Not physically, she was still freezing, but somewhere deeper, in a place the cold couldn't touch. The storm blew itself out by midnight. They waited another hour to be sure, then started moving again. Walking through the night was dangerous, but stopping meant freezing to death. Dawn of the second day found them on the outskirts of Cedar Falls. Eliza had never been so grateful to see civilization in her life. They staggered into town just as the first shopkeepers were opening their doors. People stared at them, 2 half-frozen, battered figures stumbling through the street. Someone called out, asking if they needed help, but Caleb waved them off. Morrison's, he said to Eliza. Sarah Morrison. She'll help. They made it to the trading post and Caleb pounded on the door. It opened to reveal Morrison himself, his eyes widening at the sight of them. Voss. What in the hell? Get Sarah, Caleb said, his voice barely above a whisper. Please. Morrison disappeared inside and returned moments later with his sister. Sarah took one look at them and immediately went into action. Inside, now, both of you. She ushered them into the back room of the store where a stove radiated blessed warmth. Henry, get blankets and coffee, hot as it'll go. She sat them down near the stove, wrapping blankets around their shoulders. Eliza felt tears streaming down her face, though she wasn't sure if it was from the warmth or the relief or just the accumulated exhaustion of the past week. What happened? Sarah asked gently. Caleb told her. Not everything, but enough. About Dutch Harker and Garrett Blackwood. About the siege and the fire. About their flight through the mountains. Sarah listened with growing anger on her face. Blackwood, she spat the name like a curse. That bastard's been buying up land all through the territory, but I didn't think he'd go this far. He did, Caleb said flatly. And he'll keep doing it unless someone stops him. The law. The law's 3 days away and probably in Blackwood's pocket anyway. He wouldn't do this if he thought there'd be consequences. Caleb accepted a cup of coffee from Morrison, his hands shaking as he raised it to his lips. We need supplies, ammunition, and a place to stay until we figure out our next move. You can stay here, Sarah said immediately. Henry, set up the spare room upstairs. Thank you, Eliza managed. Her own coffee had warmed her enough that she could speak without her teeth chattering. We'll work to pay you back. Hush, you'll do no such thing. You need rest, food, and time to heal. Everything else can wait. Sarah's expression softened. Besides, anyone who stands up to Garrett Blackwood has a friend in me. They spent the next 3 days recovering. Sarah and Morrison gave them a small room above the store with a real bed and warm blankets and all the food they could eat. Eliza slept for nearly 16 hours straight the first day, waking only when Sarah brought up a tray of stew and fresh bread. Caleb was in worse shape than he'd let on. The cold and exertion had aggravated old injuries, and he moved stiffly, his face tight with pain. But he refused to stay in bed, spending hours in conversation with Morrison and some of the other townspeople who stopped by. On the third day, Eliza came downstairs to find a meeting in progress. A dozen men and women crowded into the trading post, all talking at once. She recognized some of them from the first time they'd come to town. What's going on? She asked Sarah. Word got out about what happened to you two, and it turns out you're not the only ones Blackwood's targeted. Sarah gestured to the crowd. These folks have all had run-ins with him or his men. Some got bought out, some got threatened, a few fought back and lost everything. A man stepped forward, tall, weathered, with the look of someone who'd spent his life working the land. Name's Tom Hendricks. Blackwood's men burned my ranch 2 years ago when I wouldn't sell. Killed my cattle, destroyed my livelihood. I had to start over from nothing. A woman spoke up next. Emma Cartwright. They diverted the water from my property, dried up my well. By the time I realized what was happening, my crops were dead. Had no choice but to sell at a fraction of what it was worth. One by one, they told their stories. And with each story, Eliza felt her anger grow. This wasn't just about her and Caleb. This was bigger. Blackwood was a disease spreading across the territory, destroying lives wherever he went. Caleb appeared at the top of the stairs, leaning heavily on the railing. How many of you would be willing to do something about it? The room fell silent. Then Tom Hendricks spoke. What did you have in mind? We hit him where it hurts. His operation needs supplies, infrastructure, men. He's got a main camp about 15 miles west of here, near the timber operation. That's where he keeps his records, his payroll, his weapons. Caleb descended the stairs slowly. We burn it down. That's suicide, someone said. He's got 30, maybe 40 men there. Then we're smart about it. We strike at night, fast and hard, destroy what we can and get out before they can organize a response. Caleb looked around the room. I'm not saying it'll be easy, and I'm not saying it'll solve everything, but it'll hurt him. It'll show him there's a cost to his methods. He'll retaliate, Emma said. He's already retaliating, against all of us. The question is, do we keep running and hiding, or do we stand up? Eliza watched the faces in the room, saw the moment the balance tipped. These were people who'd lost everything, who'd been pushed to the edge, and in Caleb's words, they saw a chance, maybe their only chance, to push back. I'm in, Tom said. Me too, Emma added. One by one, they agreed. By the time the meeting ended, they had 15 people committed to the raid, plus a handful more who'd provide supplies and support. That night, Eliza found Caleb standing at the window of their room, staring out at the dark street. "You're really going to do this," she said. "We're really going to do this." He turned to look at her. "You don't have to come. You could stay here. Be safe." "Not happening." "Eliza, don't." She crossed the room to stand beside him. "We've had this conversation before. I'm not staying behind while you risk your life. We're in this together, remember?" He pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "I remember." They stood like that for a long time, drawing strength from each other. Outside, the town slept peacefully, unaware of what was coming. 2 days later, they rode out. 15 riders on borrowed horses, armed with whatever weapons they could scrape together. It wasn't an army, it wasn't even close, but it was something. They reached Blackwood's camp just after midnight. It was bigger than Eliza had expected. A dozen large tents, wagons loaded with timber, corrals for horses and oxen. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, but not as many as there should have been. Either Blackwood had gotten complacent, or he'd sent most of his men after Caleb and hadn't recalled them yet. They split into 3 groups. Tom's team would create a distraction at the north end. Emma's would free the horses, scattering them into the forest. And Caleb's, with Eliza at his side, would hit the main tent where Blackwood kept his records and payroll. Everything depended on timing and luck. They had plenty of the former, the latter remained to be seen. Caleb raised his hand, counting down silently with his fingers. 3, 2, 1. Tom's group lit the first fire, a supply wagon erupting in flames that lit up the night. Shouts rose from the camp as men scrambled to respond. That's when Emma's team struck, cutting the rope corrals and driving the horses into a panic. In the chaos, Caleb led his group straight to the center tent. The guard posted outside had abandoned his post to help with the fire. They slipped inside unopened and unopposed. The tent was exactly as Caleb had described. A makeshift office filled with crates, a desk covered in papers, and a locked strongbox that likely held the payroll. Eliza grabbed the papers, stuffing them into a satchel, while Caleb and 2 others broke open the strongbox. "There's got to be $5,000 here," one of the men breathed. "Take it," Caleb said. "Distribute it to everyone Blackwood forced out. It's not enough, but it's something." They were almost finished when the tent flap opened and Dutch Harker stepped inside. For a frozen moment, no one moved. Then Dutch's hand went for his gun. Caleb was faster. He tackled Dutch, both men crashing into the desk. Papers flew everywhere as they struggled, each trying to gain the upper hand. "Go!" Caleb shouted at Eliza. "Get out of here!" But she couldn't leave him. She grabbed a heavy ledger from the desk and brought it down hard on Dutch's head. He went limp, and Caleb shoved him aside. "I told you to run, and I told you I don't leave you behind." She grabbed his arm. "Now come on." They burst out of the tent just as reinforcements arrived. Bullets tore through the air around them. Someone screamed. Eliza saw Tom go down, clutching his arm, but Emma was there, hauling him back to his feet. They ran for the horses, mounted up, and rode like hell itself was chasing them. Behind them, Blackwood's camp burned, the flames visible for miles. They didn't stop until dawn, when they were sure no one was following. They'd lost 2 people in the raid, both wounded but alive, and they dealt Blackwood a blow he wouldn't soon forget. As the sun rose over the mountains, painting the snow in gold and pink, Eliza looked at Caleb and saw something she'd never seen before. Peace. Not the absence of conflict, but the hard-won calm that came from standing up for what you believed in. "What now?" she asked. He smiled, a real, genuine smile. "Now we go home, and we build that cabin." But home was gone. They rode back up the mountain 3 days after the raid, their bodies still aching from the fight, their hearts cautiously hopeful. The closer they got to the clearing, the heavier the silence became. No smoke rose from the chimney, no sound of animals greeted them, just an unnatural stillness that made Eliza's stomach clench with dread. When they finally emerged from the tree line, Caleb pulled the horse to an abrupt stop. Eliza looked past his shoulder and felt her breath catch in her throat. The cabin was gone, not damaged, not partially burned, completely gone. Nothing remained but blackened timbers and ash, a scar on the snow-covered clearing that marked where their home had stood. The barn had been torn down, the lumber scattered. Even the small shed where they'd stored tools had been destroyed. Caleb dismounted slowly, like a man in a dream, or a nightmare. He walked toward the ruins, his boots crunching through the frozen ash. Eliza followed, her hand instinctively reaching for his, but he didn't seem to notice. "They came back," he said, his voice hollow. "After we left, made sure there was nothing to come back to." Eliza knelt and picked up a piece of charred wood. It crumbled in her hand, reduced to nothing but carbon and memory. Everything they'd built, everything they'd fought for, erased. "The cave," she said suddenly. "The supplies we stored there, maybe—" But one look at Caleb's face told her it was pointless. Dutch and his men would have found the cave, would have destroyed or taken anything of value. They'd been thorough, brutally, completely thorough. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the clearing, stirring ash into small whirlwinds that danced across the snow. Eliza felt tears freezing on her cheeks, though she hadn't realized she was crying. Then Caleb did something unexpected. He laughed. It was a bitter, harsh sound, but it was real. "They think this breaks us," he said, turning to face her. "They think burning down a cabin and scattering some lumber means they've won." "Didn't they?" "No." He cupped her face in his hands, his eyes burning with an intensity that took her breath away. "A home isn't logs and nails, Eliza. It's not 4 walls and a roof. It's this." He placed his hand over her heart. "And this." He took her hand and placed it over his own. "They can burn every building on this mountain, and they still won't touch what we have." Eliza felt something shift inside her chest, the despair transmuting into something fiercer, harder. "So what do we do?" "We rebuild. Right here, in this exact spot. We make it bigger, stronger, better than before. And we do it in plain sight, daring them to try again." His jaw set in a line she knew well. "Because I'm not running anymore. This is our land, our home. And nobody, not Dutch Harker, not Garrett Blackwood, not anyone, is going to take it from us." They spent that night in the cave, huddled together for warmth. Despite Eliza's fears, Dutch's men hadn't found their emergency cache. The supplies were meager, some dried meat, a few blankets, basic tools, but it was enough to start. At dawn, they began the work of clearing the ruins. It was grueling, heartbreaking labor. Every piece of charred wood Eliza moved had been something they'd used, something they'd touched daily. The blackened remains of the table where they'd shared meals, the twisted metal of the stove where she'd learned to cook venison stew, the burned frame of the ladder leading to the loft where she'd felt safe for the first time in her life. Caleb worked in grim silence, his movements mechanical but purposeful. They salvaged what they could: nails, hinges, anything metal that had survived the fire. By sunset, they'd cleared enough space to pitch a makeshift tent using salvaged canvas and rope. That night, as they sat by a small fire, Eliza broke the silence. "How are we going to do this? We have almost nothing. No money, barely any tools, winter still weeks away from ending." "We ask for help." Caleb poked at the fire with a stick. "Tom, Emma, the others from Cedar Falls. We helped them strike back at Blackwood. Maybe they'll help us rebuild. And if they won't, then we do it ourselves. Slower, harder, but we do it." He looked at her, and despite everything, his eyes held that stubborn determination she'd come to love. "I've built 1 cabin on this mountain. I can build another." "We can build another," she corrected. He smiled. "Yeah, we can." The next morning, Caleb rode down to Cedar Falls while Eliza stayed behind to continue clearing the site. She worked until her hands bled, until her back screamed with every movement, until the sun began its descent toward the horizon. She was dragging a burned beam to the edge of the clearing when she heard horses approaching. Her heart jumped into her throat, and she grabbed the axe she'd been using as a prying bar, holding it ready. But it wasn't Dutch's men who emerged from the trees. It was Tom Hendricks, Emma Cartwright, and a dozen others from the town. Their horses were loaded with supplies: lumber, tools, sacks of nails, bundles of rope. "Heard you could use some help," Tom said, swinging down from his saddle. Eliza felt tears prick her eyes again. "You came." "Of course we came." Emma handed down a hammer and a bag of nails. "You stood with us when we needed it. Now we stand with you." Caleb arrived an hour later with Morrison and Sarah, their wagon loaded with food, blankets, and a tent large enough to shelter everyone. When he saw the crowd of people already working to clear the site, His face went through a transformation Eliza had never witnessed, from surprise to gratitude to something that looked dangerously close to hope. Sarah pulled Eliza aside while the men discussed the building plan. "How's he holding up, really?" "Better than I expected. Worse than he lets on." Eliza watched Caleb talking with Tom, his hands gesturing as he described where the new cabin would sit.
He's not just rebuilding a house, he's rebuilding his life. Everything he lost before, everything that got destroyed, he's facing it head on this time instead of running from it. "And you? How are you holding up?" Eliza considered the question. A month ago, she would have been devastated by this kind of loss. But she'd learned something on this mountain, something about the difference between possessions and purpose. "I'm tired," she admitted. "Scared, angry, but I'm also—"
She searched for the right word. "Free. Does that make sense? My whole life I was trying to fit into spaces that were too small for me. Here, with him, even with all this destruction, I'm finally the right size." Sarah smiled and squeezed her hand. "That makes perfect sense." The work began in earnest the next day. Tom and 3 other experienced builders laid out the foundation, using river stones they hauled up from the creek. The new cabin would be larger than the old one, 2 full rooms instead of 1 and a loft, with a proper fireplace built from stone and clay. Eliza worked alongside the men, and not one of them questioned her presence or suggested she should stick to women's work. She carried stones, mixed mortar, held boards steady while they were nailed into place. Her muscles, already strong from months of mountain life, grew stronger still. At night, the whole group gathered around a large fire, sharing food and stories. Emma told about the farm she'd lost and the new one she was building. Tom spoke of his plans to expand his herd, to make his ranch even better than it had been before Blackwood destroyed it. Others shared their own stories of loss and resilience, of fighting back against forces that seemed insurmountable. And gradually Eliza realized something profound. They weren't just building a cabin, they were building a community, a network of people who'd learned that standing together made them stronger than any land baron or hired gun. On the 5th day, a rider appeared at the edge of the clearing. Everyone stopped working, hands moving toward weapons, but Caleb raised his hand. "Wait, I know him." The rider was young, maybe 20, with the look of someone who'd been riding hard. He dismounted slowly, hands visible and empty. "Mr. Voss, my name's Billy Crenshaw. I worked for Garrett Blackwood." Caleb's expression hardened. "You've got 30 seconds to explain why I shouldn't run you off this mountain." "Because I'm here to help." Billy pulled a folded document from his coat. "This is Blackwood's deed to the land he's been claiming. The land that includes your property." "I've got my own deed, registered and legal." "I know. That's why Blackwood's deed is a forgery. I know because I watched him create it, watched him bribe the land office clerk to file it. He's been doing it all over the territory, claiming land that's already owned, then forcing people out before they can prove his paperwork is fake." Tom stepped forward. "Why are you telling us this?" "Because what he did to you folks, what he's been doing for years, it's wrong. I signed on to work timber, not to burn people out of their homes. When Dutch came back from the raid bragging about destroying your cabin, about how he was going to hunt you down..." Billy shook his head. "I couldn't be part of it anymore." "Where's Blackwood now?" Caleb asked. "In Cedar Falls, actually. Showed up 3 days ago with a dozen men. He's planning to file a claim on the whole mountain range, drive out anyone who won't sell. He figures after what happened at his camp, he needs to make an example. Show everyone what happens when you fight back." Eliza felt a chill run down her spine. "He's going after the town. Not violently, not at first. He's got lawyers, judges he's paid off. He'll do it legal-like, make it seem proper. By the time people realize what's happening, he'll own everything." Billy held out the forged deed. "But this proves he's been operating fraudulently. Get this in front of the territorial judge, the one Blackwood doesn't own, and his whole operation falls apart." Caleb took the document, studying it carefully. "The territorial judge is in Silver Creek. That's a week's ride from here." 5 days if you push hard," Billy said. "But you'd need to go now. Blackwood's filing his claims tomorrow." The group fell silent, everyone looking at Caleb. He stood there, the forged deed in his hands, his jaw working as he thought through the options. "If I go to Silver Creek," he said slowly, "Blackwood will know. His men will try to stop me, and they'll know this place is vulnerable. Then you don't go alone, Tom said. Take 4 good riders. The rest of us stay here, protect what we've built. It's risky. Living is risky. Emma crossed her arms. You gave us a chance to fight back. Now we're giving you a chance to end this. For good. Caleb looked at Eliza. She knew what he was asking without him having to say it. I'm coming with you, she said. Eliza, don't even try. You're not leaving me here to wonder if you're alive or dead. We're partners. That means we face this together. He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. Tom, you're in charge here. Keep everyone safe. We'll be back in 10 days, one way or another. They left at dawn the next morning. Caleb, Eliza, Tom's eldest son David, a man named Cooper who'd been a scout in the army, and Billy Crenshaw, who knew the fastest routes to Silver Creek. Morrison had supplied them with his best horses and enough provisions for the journey. The ride was punishing. They pushed the horses hard, stopping only when necessary, sleeping in shifts. Every shadow could be an ambush, every sound a potential threat. But they made good time, covering in 4 days what usually took 6. Silver Creek was a proper town, bigger than Cedar Falls, with brick buildings and paved streets. The territorial courthouse stood at the center, an imposing structure that represented the law these frontier communities desperately needed. They arrived 2 hours before the court was set to hear Blackwood's claims. Caleb strode into the courthouse with the forged deed in hand, Eliza and the others flanking him. The clerk at the desk looked up, startled. Can I help you? We need to see Judge Morrison. It's urgent. The judge is preparing for a hearing. He can't be disturbed. Caleb slapped the deed on the desk. Tell him Garrett Blackwood has been filing fraudulent land claims. Tell him we have proof. And tell him if he doesn't see us in the next 5 minutes, we're going to stand up in his courtroom and say it loud enough for everyone to hear. The clerk's eyes widened. He disappeared through a door and returned moments later. The judge will see you. Judge Morrison, no relation to the shopkeeper despite the shared name, was a man in his 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. He listened without interruption as Caleb explained everything, as Billy provided details about Blackwood's operation, as Eliza and the others added their testimonies. When they finished, the judge sat back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. These are serious allegations, he said. They're true, Billy said. I worked for the man. I saw it all. If what you're saying is accurate, Garrett Blackwood has defrauded dozens of people out of their rightfully owned land. That's not just a civil matter, that's criminal. So you'll stop him? Eliza asked. I'll do more than that. I'll issue a warrant for his arrest. The judge stood, his face grim. But you understand he's a powerful man. He has resources, connections. This won't be a quick or easy fight. We're not afraid of a fight, Caleb said. The judge smiled slightly. No, I don't imagine you are. The hearing that afternoon was unlike anything Eliza had ever witnessed. Garrett Blackwood arrived with a team of lawyers and an air of absolute confidence. He was a tall man, impeccably dressed, with the kind of face that belonged in expensive portraits. He smiled at the judge like they were old friends. That smile disappeared when Judge Morrison read the charges. Fraud? That's absurd. Blackwood's lead lawyer jumped to his feet. My client is a respected businessman. Your client is a criminal, the judge interrupted. And I have documented evidence of his crimes, multiple witnesses willing to testify, and a pattern of behavior that goes back years. Blackwood's eyes scanned the courtroom and landed on Billy. Something dark and ugly crossed his face. You, he said, his voice dripping with venom. You little traitor. I'm not a traitor for doing the right thing, Billy said steadily. The judge banged his gavel. Mr. Blackwood, you are under arrest. Bailiff, take him into custody. What happened next was chaos. Blackwood's men tried to intervene, but the bailiff and several armed deputies were ready. A brief scuffle broke out, but it ended quickly with 3 of Blackwood's men in custody alongside their boss. As Blackwood was led away in chains, he turned back to look at Caleb. This isn't over, he said. I have friends, resources. You think one judge can stop me? I think you underestimated the wrong people, Caleb replied, and that's going to cost you everything. They stayed in Silver Creek for 3 more days while the judge reviewed all the evidence and began the process of invalidating Blackwood's fraudulent claims. Other victims came forward, emboldened by Caleb's actions. The scope of Blackwood's crimes became clear. He'd defrauded more than 50 families across 3 territories. On the morning of the 4th day, Judge Morrison called them into his chambers. "I wanted you to know," he said, "Garrett Blackwood will be tried for fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. If convicted, and he will be convicted, he's looking at 20 years in federal prison. His entire operation is being dismantled. Every fraudulent claim will be investigated and overturned." "What about his men?" Eliza asked. "Dutch, Harker, and the others." "Warrants have been issued. They'll be found and prosecuted." The judge leaned forward. "You did something remarkable. You stood up when most people would have run. And because of that, dozens of families will get their land back. We'll get justice." Caleb shook his head. "We just did what needed doing. That's what makes it remarkable." They rode back to the mountain with lighter hearts than they'd had in weeks. The weather was changing, the brutal cold of winter giving way to something gentler. The snow began to melt, revealing the first hints of green beneath. When they crested this final ridge and looked down into their clearing, Eliza gasped. The cabin was nearly finished. The walls stood strong and true, the roof was on, and smoke rose from the new stone chimney. People moved around the site, putting finishing touches on what was clearly going to be a beautiful home. Tom saw them coming and waved, a huge grin on his face. "Well, did it work?" "Blackwood's in custody," Caleb said as he dismounted. "It's over, really over." A cheer went up from the assembled workers. Emma hugged Eliza so hard she could barely breathe, and even Morrison, who'd stayed to help with the building, cracked a rare smile. "Come on," Tom said. "Let us show you what we've built." The cabin was perfect. The main room was twice the size of the old one, with windows that let in real light. The second room was smaller but comfortable, with enough space for a proper bed and storage. The fireplace was a work of art, built to draw efficiently and throw heat into every corner. "There's more," Sarah said, leading them outside to the back of the cabin. "We started a proper garden plot, and Tom's boys built you a new barn, bigger than before." Eliza walked through it all in a daze, touching the smooth wood, marveling at the craftsmanship. It was more than just a cabin. It was a home, built by people who cared, who decided that what happened here mattered. That night, everyone gathered for a celebration. They roasted the last of the winter venison, baked bread in the new oven, and passed around bottles of whiskey that Morrison had brought up from the store. Stories were told, songs were sung, and for the first time since the siege, Eliza felt true, uncomplicated joy. As the fire burned down and people began to drift off to their own camps and tents, Caleb took Eliza's hand and led her to the porch they'd added to the front of the cabin, a wide, solid structure that looked out over the clearing toward the mountains beyond. They sat together, shoulders touching, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "You were right," Caleb said softly. "About what?" "About this being more than just survival, about building something worth having." He turned to look at her, and in the dim light she could see the emotion in his eyes. "When I lost my family, I thought that was it. Thought I'd used up all my chances at happiness. But you showed me that's not how it works. Life keeps giving you chances if you're brave enough to take them." Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder. "We both got a second chance. Together." "Yeah, together." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Marry me." She sat up, searching his face. "What?" "Marry me. For real this time. Not just as a transaction or a convenience. Marry me because I love you and I want to spend the rest of my life building this with you." Eliza felt tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, of course, yes." He kissed her then, deep and thorough and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "I don't have a ring," he admitted. "I don't need one. I just need you." They married 2 weeks later in Cedar Falls with half the town in attendance. Sarah and Emma stood up with Eliza, while Tom and Morrison flanked Caleb. Billy Crenshaw was there too, having decided to stay in the area and help with the rebuilding efforts. The ceremony was simple but beautiful. They exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to stand together through whatever came, to build a life worth living, to never let fear make them small. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers could probably be heard in the next county. Spring came in full force, transforming the mountain from a harsh white wilderness into something green and alive. Eliza's garden flourished, providing fresh vegetables for the first time since she'd arrived. The barn filled with new animals, goats, chickens, and a young mare that would eventually replace the horse they'd lost. Word of their victory over Blackwood spread throughout the territory. Other families who'd been displaced began to return, reclaiming their land and rebuilding their lives. A loose network formed, people helping each other, sharing resources, standing together against any future threats. Caleb and Eliza's cabin became a gathering place, a symbol of what could be accomplished when people refused to back down. On warm summer evenings, neighbors would ride up for dinner, for conversation, for the simple pleasure of community. One evening in late July, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, Eliza sat on the porch working on a piece of embroidery, something Sarah had taught her during the long winter months. Caleb came out and sat beside her, 2 cups of coffee in hand. "Penny for your thoughts," he said. Eliza set down her work and accepted the coffee. "I was thinking about that day in Blackwater Ridge, when I walked up to you and told you we were getting married. That was either the bravest thing or the craziest thing I'd ever seen." "Both," she said with a smile. "Definitely both. But I was thinking about how desperate I was, how I felt like I had nothing, like I was nothing, and how wrong I was." "You were never nothing." "I know that now, but then I thought the only thing I had to offer was my labor, my ability to work. I didn't know I had so much more." She looked at him, her eyes bright. "I had courage I didn't know existed. I had strength I'd never been allowed to use, and I had the capacity to love someone so completely it scared me." Caleb set down his cup and pulled her close. "You gave me my life back, gave me a reason to care about tomorrow, instead of just surviving until nightfall." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the day fade into night. The mountain was peaceful, the only sounds the wind in the trees and the distant call of night birds. "I'm pregnant," Eliza said suddenly. Caleb went very still. "What?" "I'm pregnant. About 3 months along, I think. I wanted to be sure before I told you." He turned to face her fully, his expression cycling through shock, joy, and fear in rapid succession. "A baby. We're going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, suddenly nervous. They'd never discussed children, never talked about what a family might look like. "Happy?" He laughed, a sound of pure joy. "Eliza, I'm terrified and thrilled and about a dozen other things I don't have words for. But yes, I'm happy." He pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was something precious and fragile. But she wasn't fragile. She'd proven that over and over. She was strong, resilient, capable of weathering any storm. Winter came again, but this time they were ready. The cabin was warm and well-stocked, the barn full of healthy animals. When the first snow fell, Eliza stood at the window watching it accumulate, one hand resting on her swollen belly. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, coming up behind her. "That a year ago I was standing in a town square being sold like cattle, and now—" She gestured at the cabin, at the life they'd built. "Now I'm standing in my own home with my husband, waiting for our child to be born. It doesn't seem real sometimes." "It's real." He wrapped his arms around her, his hands covering hers on her belly. All of it, every hard-won inch. Their daughter was born on a cold February morning, arriving with a loud cry that filled the cabin with sound and life. Sarah and Emma were there to help, along with a midwife from Cedar Falls. Caleb paced outside until Sarah finally took pity on him and let him in. When he held his daughter for the first time, Eliza saw tears streaming down his face. "She's perfect," he whispered. "Absolutely perfect." "What should we name her?" Eliza asked. He thought for a moment, then smiled. "Hope, because that's what she is. That's what all of this is." Hope Voss grew up strong and wild and free, racing through the mountain forests with the confidence of someone who'd never been told she was too much. She learned to shoot from her father, to track and hunt and survive. She learned to garden and preserve and sew from her mother, but also to stand her ground and fight for what she believed in. When she was 5, a second child arrived, a boy they named Thomas, after Tom Hendricks, who'd become like family. And 3 years after that, twin girls who kept everyone on their toes. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family. New rooms were added, a second story built. But they kept the original porch, the one where Caleb had proposed, because some things were too important to change. Years passed. Children grew. The network of families on the mountain strengthened, becoming a true community. A school was built, then a small church for those who wanted it, then a community hall where people gathered for dances and meetings. Eliza and Caleb grew older together, their hair graying, their faces weathering like the mountain itself. But they never lost the fire that had brought them together, never stopped fighting for the life they'd built. On their 20th anniversary, they sat on that same porch, watching their grandchildren play in the clearing where once there had been nothing but ash and destruction. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked. "Giving up civilization for this?" Eliza laughed. "Giving up civilization? I gained everything worth having. A home, a family, a purpose." She took his hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of decades of practice. "I was never meant for their version of civilization anyway. Too much fire, remember?" "Not too much," he said, kissing her hand. "Exactly right." As the sun set over the mountains, painting everything in gold and amber, Eliza reflected on the path that had brought her here. From that terrible day in Blackwater Ridge to this moment of perfect peace, every step had been necessary. Every struggle had shaped her into someone stronger, someone more herself than she'd ever been in that dusty town. She'd come to this mountain with nothing but desperation and courage. She'd fought for every inch of the life she wanted, had stood side by side with the man she loved against forces that seemed insurmountable. And through it all, she'd learned the most important lesson of her life. Strength wasn't about being hard or unyielding. It was about knowing when to bend and when to stand firm. It was about facing your fears and choosing love over safety, risk over certainty. It was about building something worth fighting for, then fighting like hell to keep it. The woman who'd once been called too much had found a place where she was exactly enough. And in doing so, she had helped create a legacy that would outlast them all. A community built on courage, a home built on love, and a family built on the unshakable belief that the best things in life are worth whatever it costs to earn them. As darkness fell and the stars emerged one by one, Caleb and Eliza sat together on their porch, surrounded by the sounds of family and the peace of home. They'd survived the frontier, yes, but more than that, they'd conquered it, transforming a harsh wilderness into a place of belonging, and in the end, that was everything.